I've been looking forward to having this collection of group folks. I get lots of opportunities to talk to different groups, CFOs and people that are involved with financial decision making, either in their organizations or assisting other organizations, can be super helpful to us. So I'm going to just warn you now that at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to participate in a couple of things. One is a very quick survey that we're going to do here that I think you'll find interesting. And then the second piece is I'm actually going to try to engage you in maintaining an ongoing relationship with us by participating in a survey that we do quarterly. So let me start by getting through the things that every Fed speaker is required to do, which is basically to tell you that the views that I'm about to express are mine and mine alone. There is one person that can speak for the Federal Reserve, and some of you have heard me make this comment before. Chairman Powell could not join us today. You are stuck with me. As Nan said, my role is really to serve as basically the liaison between Main Street and Fed policy making for our district. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that. Along with a couple of other things that we wanted to do. We felt like level setting in terms of who the Fed is, what the Fed is all about would be helpful. I recognize that there are some people in here that are probably Fed followers, Fed geeks even maybe, and there may be some folks that don't know a whole lot about us. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about that. As I mentioned, talk a little bit about the RAIN initiative, and then I'll spend the last part of my time talking about what we're seeing in the economy, and as I said to John earlier, your other speaker, hopefully teeing up some of the conversation that he's going to have with you. So to begin with, the Federal Reserve is an interesting organization. I'll talk about the structure in just a minute, but we are charged by Congress with two responsibilities, and it's basically what you've heard about the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve, and that is facilitating conditions that would support maximum employment and maintaining an environment of stable prices. We have a number of other responsibilities that we're involved with. The three that the Federal Reserve of Atlanta is most closely tied to are supervision and regulation, financial services, and of course monetary policy. And just very quickly, supervision and regulation, each Federal Reserve office, and there are 12 of them around the country, have this responsibility. It's a delegated responsibility from the Board of Governors and involves an oversight of certain types of banks. So along with the other two primary regulators, we are responsible specifically for overseeing state chartered banks, bank and financial holding companies, and then international banking organizations. And so for my colleagues that are part of this part of the bank, it's an interesting collection of financial organizations that they are working with, because in effect we are focused on the very smallest and the very largest. And so you've got folks obviously that specialize in those areas and that get involved with the oversight of those different types of banks. And then again, our other regulating colleagues are involved with overseeing the other financial institutions. From a financial services perspective, and you're sitting in a Fed branch, branches typically and historically have been big operation centers. That has changed a bit as our as citizens, as participants in the payment system, our approaches to making payments have changed. But we're still involved in a number of things. And for those of you that are able to stay for the tour later, you will get to see a part of this, and that's the currency responsibility that we have. So in effect, we serve as the bank for banks, so financial institutions. I heard Bank of America mentioned earlier. When Bank of America needs to make a deposit, they come to the Fed. And when Bank of America needs to make a withdrawal, they will also come to the Fed. So in effect, we're doing the same thing that a commercial bank would do, but just on a much, much larger scale. We also serve as the bank for the government. So new currency comes through the Federal Reserve banks. Obviously, that is produced by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and we also get new coin from the Mint. So all that makes its way through the Federal Reserve banks and ultimately out into the banking system. Historically, we've been involved with processing checks. So I've been with the bank for 32 years now, and when I started at the Fed, Our biggest operation, for example, in this office was check clearing. We had 150, 200 people that were involved with checks. And actually, most of those people worked at night, because what was happening is all of us as consumers were making our transactions during the day. The banks were collecting all of those items and then depositing those with us beginning in the afternoon and up until about 2 o'clock in the morning. And then we had this operation going on where we were sorting items and frantically racing to get these items cleared, oftentimes on the planes. So you're trying to meet certain deadlines, because if you got a check that was going to clear in San Francisco, for example, you had to have a way to get it there physically. And so the Fed was involved in this very manual, very labor-intensive process. This office actually was one of the largest check processors in the country. I think our peak 24-hour period, we moved 5 million different checks. That's a lot of checks to arrive in a bag, to sort, and then to figure out whether they're paid locally, if they're paid somewhere in our region, or if they're going to be paid somewhere else in the U.S. Almost all of that has gone away. First of all, people are writing a lot fewer checks. Those that are written are turned into an electronic payment very early in the process, so there's no longer a physical movement of items. It's made that process, I think, a lot more efficient and has reduced some risk in that area. One of the things that's unique about the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta is we are also home to what is called the Retail Payments Office for the Federal Reserve System. So what that means is that the Atlanta Bank is charged with driving strategy for retail payments, which includes checks and electronic payments and so on. And a part of that responsibility involves thinking about, is there a way to clear items faster? Is there a way to reduce risk? And so some of you are likely familiar with an initiative that we have called FedNow that's going to, over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, move us to a real-time settlement system where there's no longer this lag in items clearing. That as a buyer, we will have the opportunity to make an immediate payment for an item, and as the seller, you will have the opportunity to get immediate payment versus having these things happening sometimes behind the scenes that folks aren't even aware of. The other thing that everybody in this room, of course, is going to be most familiar with from the perspective of the Fed's responsibilities would be monetary policy. This is what tends to drive all the headlines. When you hear about the Federal Reserve in the Wall Street Journal, they're probably not talking about electronic payments. They might be, but usually they're talking about this. And again, I mentioned the dual mandate. The idea of monetary policy is to try to meet those two responsibilities that have been given to us. It's a little bit unique among global central banks. There are only a handful that have an employment mandate. Almost all central banks have an inflation mandate, but it's somewhat unique to also have an employment mandate. I think most policymakers in the Federal Reserve System like the fact that that is a part of our responsibility, but it's an interesting balance in terms of trying to maintain stable prices and also create conditions that are conducive to maximum employment. In terms of the structure of the Fed, again, we're an interesting organization. When I tell people I work for the Fed, they'll be like, oh, you work for the government. And my first reaction is, no, I don't. I should probably be a little bit careful with that because the government's a good thing, right? And we have elements of the government. So the Board of Governors, which is the entity that's located in Washington, D.C., is the part of the Fed that functions most like a governmental organization, including the governors themselves. They are named, nominated by the president, and they are confirmed by the Senate. And then the staff of the board functions much like a governmental organization. The reserve banks function more like private sector entities. They are separately chartered. They function with an independent board of directors and with their own president that is named by that board of directors, but with oversight from the Board of Governors. So I would say that the reserve banks themselves are more quasi-governmental, certainly with a lot of oversight from governmental entities. And then the leaders of those two organizations come together to form the Federal Open Market Committee, a policy-making body. So you have the 12 Reserve Bank presidents, and then the members of the Board of Governors that come together and make up the FOMC. Our current Board of Governors is composed of 5 folks. There are actually 7 positions. 2 of those are currently vacant. Again, I mentioned that these are presidential nominees that have to be confirmed by the Senate. The president has indicated that there are some names for those other two positions, but you're probably aware there have been some other things going on in Washington that have taken up some time. So our current governors are up there on the slide for you, with, of course, Jay Powell being the chairman. And it's interesting, we have two vice chairs. There's always been kind of the traditional vice chair. The vice chair for supervision is a position that was created following the financial crisis. So the idea was that we needed to have a designated governor that was focused specifically on the supervision aspect of the Federal Reserve's responsibilities. On the Reserve Bank side, as I said, there are 12 Reserve banks. This picture gives you a sense of where they're located around the country. The photos you see are depictions of the current Reserve Bank presidents. If you notice, there's a concentration of Reserve banks on the eastern side of the country. I think that speaks to where were the centers of commerce when the Federal Reserve was created back in 1913. So we are a bit more than 100 years old. We've evolved a bit over that period of time, and certainly from the perspective of both operations as well as thinking about how the Federal Reserve interacts with the economy, there's been, I think, tremendous movement there. Raphael Bostic is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He's been with us now for a couple of years. We still think of him as the new guy. Like I said, I've been here 32 years, so I'm now at the point where I'm like, 2 or 3 years, you're still brand new. But Raphael has actually, in a very short amount of time, I think, become one of the more influential members of the FOMC, and from his role as president, he gets a lot of press coverage. And I think the reason for that has to do a bit with his background, because Raphael, he is a classically trained economist. Before he came to us, he was teaching at USC, but not the one that we're all familiar with. This is the University of Southern California. So we've had to try to train him on becoming a Southerner. I think we're making progress there. Is he eating grits yet, Chris? I don't. Raphael's been a really great addition to the team. And so now I'm really speaking off the cuff here, but for a couple reasons. I think, number one, he is the first African-American Reserve Bank president, so we're proud of that. But I think much more important is the fact that he brings a perspective that not only focuses on his area of expertise, which is housing, obviously an important part of the U.S. economy, but there's kind of a youthful energy, for lack of a better way of putting it, that I haven't seen in my experience with the Fed before. At least in our bank, we have traditionally been an organization that has either promoted from within to this position or has gone out and found someone that is very, very tenured. And Raphael's predecessor, for example, Dennis Lockhart, who I'm just a huge fan of and remain a friend of, but Dennis was someone who this role was kind of a capstone in his career. Whereas for Raphael, I think he's kind of mid-career. And so, like I said, there's this exuberance that has been very refreshing for those of us that work in the bank. As you can see, we are a large part of the Federal Reserve System. As a matter of fact, our territory, if you were just to pull it out and make it its own economy, I think we're somewhere in the neighborhood of being the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world. And it's interesting, you can see we have a number of branches, including our head office in Atlanta, or in addition to our head office in Atlanta. One of the things that I think is really neat about the territory that we happen to be in is both from an employment perspective as well as a contribution to growth, kind of a proportional GDP perspective. The Southeast looks almost exactly like the US. So while in our individual cities we may have very distinct areas of emphasis, and I always use Orlando as an example, obviously very tourism heavy in that part of the state, but then you may go to a part of Alabama that would be very agriculture heavy. But again, when you take all of these economies and combine them into the Southeast United States, we proportionally look a lot like the US. So we like to think that we're able to represent what's happening at a broad level in a way that's instructive. And so that brings me to this Regional Economic Information Network that you've heard mentioned a couple times now. We call it RAIN for short. This is something that we established right around the time of the financial crisis. And I mentioned Dennis Lockhart earlier. Dennis had come on as a new president. His background was in business, and so he was thinking about, how do I kind of make my mark on the committee? You know, how can I be of some use, add value to the Federal Open Market Committee? And Dennis recognized that we had this very large geographic footprint. We have this very large collection of contacts already built in, because each of our offices has a board of directors. So we went into this with kind of 44 distinct voices. Dennis's view was, let's put our foot on the gas and really grow this network. And so we very rapidly built up a network that numbers somewhere in the neighborhood of, I would say, about 800 contacts that me and my counterparts around the district reach out to basically connect Main Street to policymaking. And so what we've tried to do is look at businesses of all sizes. We talk to nonprofit organizations, to governmental organizations, to members of academia. The idea is to really supplement the work that our economists do with the voices that are on the ground, that are having to make decisions in real time as to what's going on in the economy. So I'm going to play you this video, and this will give you, I think, a good sense of what RAIN is all about, and then I'll tell you just a little bit more.
Some people think our economists and policymakers never get outside of the marble walls of the Fed, but they don't know about this remarkable interaction between the people at the Federal Reserve Bank and the community that we serve. Our bank representatives go out and collect information by talking to people. This program came about because we realized there was a wealth of information that we wanted to be able to tap as we went about the business of trying to understand what's really going on in the economy.
I think the economic data that I share with the Atlanta Fed is used as an anecdotal confirmation of what the Fed economists see in some of the data. The questions revolve around employment, inventory, wage growth. For us in automotive, it might be about auto loans. Are we seeing a lot more people taking out credit, or are they paying cash?
The airport activity depends very much on what the economy is doing. I meet frequently with our bank representatives, and we talk about what's happening in the economy. People can't believe that I'm engaged in it. I'm not an economist, I'm not a financier, but I certainly am at the heart of observing what's going on in the community.
In addition to getting the insight of the Federal Reserve's economists, it's a chance for me to learn a little bit more about what others are seeing that are not necessarily in my industry. The Fed resources that I use the most are the monthly reports, which give a running update of what's going on in different sectors of the economy, particularly areas like retail that I don't see a lot of. You get some indication of sentiment. You know, what are people thinking? Because those are my customers. So access to that type of information is really, really valuable.
It's a unique opportunity to be able to share what's going on in the grassroots level, and to have the Fed listen to us and to actually craft policy based on a lot of the things that they're hearing is a very important opportunity. The information that we share is passed on to the president of the Fed, who is listening.
Miami is a small business community. Now, these are businesses that do not have the privilege of having economists on board to be able to help them guide their decisions. So having access to the brain power of the Fed and having the opportunity to have substantial dialogues about these issues is something that a lot of people value in this community. And it's something that I feel very proud to be associated with.
Knowing that the information that we share is used in a very positive sense to assist the Fed in crafting monetary policy is very important to me as a citizen of this country.
After joining the Fed and learning more about what the bank really does and its true role in the economy, you can't help but become an advocate for the Federal Reserve. This is how the Fed is working to better manage the U.S. economy.
So the scene in there where you see us all sitting around the table, the way this process works is in any given FOMC cycle, my colleagues and I will talk to somewhere around 100 different contacts. And these tend to be either CEOs or CFOs of the organizations that I mentioned earlier. And then what happens is we put together kind of a synopsis of what we've heard at the branch level. So for me, my territory includes obviously Jacksonville, but Orlando and Tampa are part of my territory. So I pulled together a recap from that level. And then we all come together in Atlanta and we really work to put together a story that is representative of the district. And again, that scene you saw where we're all sitting around the table, that really happens ahead of every FOMC meeting. We sit down with Raphael and we have a discussion about what we've heard. Typically, it aligns with what our economists are thinking, because we've got a whole team of PhDs that are looking at the data that's coming in and using pretty sophisticated models to try to drive projections of what's going to happen in the future. So oftentimes, the stories that we're telling are just adding color to that. But where we see the real value of what we do is hearing from folks like you is going to get us in front of changes that may be happening, that aren't showing up in the data yet. And so that's where we feel like this adds tremendous value. And so just to give you an example, as we look back over the last few years, we had seen, for example, this very strong labor market that we've had now for a number of years. We saw that strengthening well before it was showing up in the actual data that everybody was looking at. And so there are other examples like that I could give where we find this to be really useful. What literally happens is we put together, along with a couple of the economists that we work with, the initial talking points for Raphael. Obviously, Raphael is the final editor, and he is out there talking to folks too, so I want to be sure that that's very clear to everyone. But ultimately, he will make the call on what he's going to share, and in the FOMC meeting, they actually do a go-around where each of the participants has an opportunity to share their perspectives on kind of the state of the economy. And in our case, again, this is our opportunity to share what we're hearing from folks like you. So we feel like this is very influential. I'm biased, and so again, these represent my views, but I happen to think that our bank has the strongest approach to gathering this type of information. Our hope is that the other banks come along with us because we think it's helpful to get Main Street involved across the entire Fed system. So I want to spend a few minutes just throwing some charts up. You can't have a Fed conversation without seeing a few charts, and to give you a sense of where we see the economy. Of course, the FOMC met recently. So this is the statement from their policy meeting that took place last week, I believe. And you know, it's been relatively consistent with what we've been seeing. We've been seeing overall growth in a range around 2%. We've been seeing job gains that have remained reasonably steady. Household spending has been increasing. I wouldn't say in any kind of an aggressive way, but it has been moving. And we've seen business spending, CapEx, remaining relatively weak. Of course, there's been a lot of tension with regard to trade, and so imports and exports are something that we've been watching. Inflation has been running relatively steady, just below 2%. I'm going to have pictures of all of these things that will, I think, emphasize some of this. So we'll start with growth. This is what we call a candy cane chart, and we just call it that because there's a lot of pretty colors on there. Basically, what this is showing you is different parts of the economy, and if it's a color that is above the zero line, that means it's contributing to growth. If it's below, it's subtracting from growth, and then that dark black line that's running through there gives you the overall for a particular quarter. And so you can get a sense, if you just on a quick glance look at that light green color, that represents the consumer. Everyone in this room knows that the consumer is what drives the U.S. economy. So we've been, as I said, in this space right around 2% for a number of quarters. One of the things that's Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta resource that you may be familiar with, particularly if you watch CNBC, because this gets a lot of press on that show, something called GDP Now. You can actually, it's an app you can put on your phone, but one of our economists looks at data that's coming in real time and has a system that attempts to, based on actual data, give a sense of, based on what we know, here's what GDP currently looks like for that particular quarter. So that's something you might be interested in paying attention to. From an employment perspective, I've already mentioned a couple times, it's hard to complain about the labor market today. We continue to add in excess of 100,000 jobs a month. Honestly, if you had asked me 2 or 3 years ago, when is this going to slow down, I would have predicted 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, the ability of business to continue to add to this has I think, surprised a number of us. Even after talking with some of our contacts, the numbers that have been coming in have been even more positive. While we have seen that momentum slow a bit, this is still above, on average, what it would take to keep the unemployment rate about solid. Our projections say that it takes about 100 to 120,000 jobs created each month to keep the unemployment rate steady, and we've been averaging for the last year about 175,000. And so you're seeing an unemployment rate that by historical standards is quite low, and the labor force participation rate has been on a slow uptick for many months now. Here's another picture with a lot of colors with giving you a snapshot of the labor market. What's really important for you to recognize here is just the fact that there are a lot of colors. And what that means is that almost all parts of the economy are adding jobs. So again, if it's above the zero line, that's showing net additions to positions in those particular sectors. And you actually have to look for those rare quarters or months where you actually see a reduction in different types of jobs that have been created. Now, as we look at this year, we can talk a little bit about what we're hearing. We're not hearing significant changes in terms of business planning for jobs, but there are a couple things that I would list as uncertainties for 2020 that could impact this as the year unfolds. And finally, from an inflation perspective, you are likely familiar with the fact that the FOMC, I think back in 2012, set an inflation target of 2%. There's a lot of discussion about this target, partly because I think initially a number of folks maybe interpreted that as meaning this is a ceiling, that the Fed would only be satisfied if inflation got up to 2%, but not above. And I think Chairman Powell has done a good job in recent months of really trying to emphasize that this is a symmetric target. I don't know that anybody in the Federal Reserve expects to hit 2.0 consistently, but to hit some range around 2% over a longer period of time is what the expectation would be. And as you can see by a number of measures, these are 3 that we have to look at, but there are a lot more. We have been pretty consistently under achieving from an inflation perspective. Oftentimes I get asked, well, why do you want 2% inflation anyway? What's wrong with 0% inflation? And I think the easiest way to think about that is you want to have some amount of growth. So a level of growth that is manageable. As business folks, you want to be able to have some predictability and expectation for being able to move price in a reasonable way over time. So 0 is probably not the goal you would set either. From a technical perspective, I also like to mention to people that keep in mind as a central bank, we are very experienced and have the tools to deal with inflation. We don't have much experience, and honestly, I'm not sure that we have a lot of tools to deal with deflation. So when this actually falls below 0, and so from my perspective, having a 2% target gives you a little bit of breathing room, so that you're not getting too low, you're not approaching the deflationary area. Within our bank, we're having a number of conversations about which is the actual best measure to follow. The committee focuses on the PCE measure, and again, I've got a couple different versions of that. Some folks actually prefer what's called a trimmed mean, which is where you lop off the most extreme measures, because those tend to be very cyclical and very short-term. And so, again, if you happen to like that measure, you're probably feeling pretty good about where we are. But again, I think you're going to continue to hear Chairman Powell and Raphael use phrases like a symmetric target, particularly in the press conferences that have taken place after the last few FOMC meetings. There have been a lot of discussion, especially in the Q&A, about our comfort with allowing inflation to rise and perhaps rise a little bit above 2% for some period of time, reflecting the fact that we've allowed it to run somewhat below 2% for some period of time. Now, if you were asking me, would we be satisfied if it went up to 5%? I think my answer would be no. So again, I'm talking about within a pretty tight range. But again, as you can see, for most of the recovery, we've been running somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5%. So my sense is that there's an opportunity or a possibility that we could see inflation running a bit higher than what we've seen over the last few years. So what did the committee do after the last meeting? As you know, they didn't do anything. We left the Fed funds rate alone. They continued with this conversation, the direction that we've had about things that we're going to continue to pay attention to. Perhaps a better way to think about it is, where is the Fed funds rate going? Anybody in the room heard of the dot plot? I would imagine probably all of you have heard. You just don't raise your hand. This probably gets more attention than it deserves, but I put it up here just because it's something to look at, and it's kind of fun to talk about. These dots represent the individual participants on the Federal Open Market Committee and where they think the Fed funds rate is going to go as of the end of each of these years. So they did this one back in December, so obviously everybody had a pretty good sense of where they thought 2019 was going to end, since they just voted on it. But it gets more interesting as you look out into 2020 and beyond. And there's an important caveat here. This is based on the individual views of appropriate monetary policy. So you may have differences of opinion about what's going to happen from a monetary policy perspective. But assuming appropriate policy and the economy unfolds the way the individual policymaker thinks it's going to, that's where they put their dot. And so you can see that for 2020, you still have a majority of participants that see the Fed's fund rate not moving from where we are today. And then it gets a lot squishier as you move out into the future. In 2021, you've got I guess that's 100 basis point difference, and it actually spreads beyond that as you go out a little bit further, which I think just speaks to a bit of the uncertainty that exists around the committee now about what is the neutral rate of the Fed funds rate. So I guess the way I would look at that is that it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 2.5%. I also like to remind people that this is just like predicting the weather. You know, every time you watch the news, the guy gets another opportunity tomorrow, right, to update his forecast. These committee members get that opportunity once a quarter as well. So as data is coming in, as they get a new view of the economy, as things are changing, we'll get a quarter down the road and they'll have an opportunity to update this. So I find this personally to be a useful tool, not so much because of what's on it at any given time, but in terms of how it's changing from quarter to quarter. So this is something that you may want to pay attention to. And finally, I want to just give you a quote from Raphael. And this is interesting. I mentioned Dennis Lockhart earlier. This is a really cool tradition that the Atlanta Rotary has, and that is to have, in their first meeting of every year, the Atlanta Fed president speaks. And this has been happening for years and years. Well, for the last couple of years, they've had the privilege of not only having Raphael be the kind of keynote, but they've had Dennis Lockhart, his predecessor, who I mentioned to you earlier, be the facilitator of the conversation. And so this is actually just taken from a much, much longer conversation. But I just wanted to give you a sense that I think Raphael's view is that the economy is actually performing quite well. And from a policy perspective, we probably are in a space where we're not looking to having to move the rate either up or down. Now, again, all of that could change. You could have a black swan event. There could be things that unfold as the year moves along. I mentioned earlier some uncertainties. We've got the potential for a pandemic. Obviously, that's on people's radar. Everyone knows that there's an election this year, so as the year unfolds, that could begin creating some other situations that we're paying attention to. But as things stand right now, and our best guess about where things are headed, it looks like 2020 is going to continue to unfold in a way that looks very similar to what it looks like now. I can tell you from my perspective and from the people that I talked to, first off, 2019 was a pleasant surprise for a lot of our contacts, and that was after many of them found 2018 to be a record-setting year. I don't think many thought that 2019 would be able to be as good. And ultimately, not for everybody, but for a number of contacts, they ended up having a 2019 that was quite strong. And they were thinking that 2020 is going to look at this point, based on what they know, pretty similar to 2019, and that's how they're building that into their own planning. So I told you about one thing I'm going to ask you to do in real time, and I think Chris is passing this out. A couple of you, I think, have done this before, so if you'll indulge us, you can update your vote. But I think most of you in the room are familiar with DEFCON. This is this US and UK military readiness index, right? And so you can see how they think about what's going on. To give you an example, immediately following 9/11, you would expect that the DEFCON level would have increased to 1 or 2, right? One of our economists who has a sense of humor, and I love doing this during breakfast meetings, has created something similar that he calls the Bacon Index. Come on. Don't get some more for Bacon standing for business activity conditions. And basically he's created, again, a 5-level view. And what I'd like for each of you to do, this is hopefully very simple for you, just take the document that Chris has given you and just circle, based on what you're experiencing in your own business, where do you think we are from a business activity perspective, and as you think about 2020? And what we're going to do is, along with other groups that we're talking to and actually individuals that we're interfacing with during this particular FOMC cycle, we'll be sharing this feedback with Raphael when we get into the latter part of the cycle. So again, when we're all sitting around the table, I'll be sharing with him that this Jacksonville CFO group collectively said that the Bacon level is wherever it is. Once you've circled, I'll tell you what we've been hearing. But I'll give you just a second to do that. And when I start seeing people making eye contact with me, then I'll move on. There may be those of you that just don't want to make eye contact. And just keep things moving. I might go ahead. Like I said, once you've done that, just circle and just leave it, and we'll pick that up after the event is over. The other thing that I mentioned to you earlier, and selfishly, this is a reason we were really enthusiastic about having you guys, is we would love to have each and every one of you participate in this CFO survey that we are doing in partnership with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond and with Duke. And so this is already an entity that has quite a bit of respect. Duke has had a version of this that's been going on for a number of years. We are really trying to blow this up and get a lot of participants. It is a quarterly survey that takes about 8 to 10 minutes. And I mentioned to Nan earlier, one of the things that I will dangle out to you guys is that if you are a participant in this thing, in 2021, the Federal Reserve Banks of Atlanta and Richmond are planning to host a joint meeting that will include, as it's currently scheduled, both presidents of those banks. And so participants, again, space permitting, will be invited to participate in this event. It'll give you a chance to basically sit at the table with a couple different Federal Reserve Bank presidents. And again, this shouldn't be a heavy lift. It's basically to get a sense of what you see on a number of different questions. These are all optimized so you can do them on your phone or what have you, and not take up too much of your time. But really will, we think, have an influence over time on what we're thinking about how the economy is going. So the way to participate in this is quite simple. There is a bowl in the back corner of the room. You can just simply put your business card. If you would, on the back of your card, write the number of employees that are part of the organization that you're representing, because we do try to slice and dice these things, so we like to look by how large the organization is from a headcount perspective. That's the easiest way to do it, because we will get you entered into the system. Or if you prefer, you can take the handout that Chris gave you and you can go online and register yourself. But like I said, we'd really love to have you. You are the target audience for this thing, so we really appreciate your participation. So I'm going to stop and see what questions you have, and then we'll also have time at the end of John's presentations to go questions to him. And if you have questions for me, I can come up with as well. But any questions at this point? Yes, sir.
When you talk to CFOs, CEOs in the community, what type of businesses do you look for? Just regional type businesses that give you a regional picture, global type businesses?
Yeah. It's a great question. So if you didn't hear it, was what types of businesses make up this network of contacts that we have? And I'll tell you, when we got this thing off the ground, we were focusing on, and to this day, we still call them large revenue producers. And the thinking being that at the end of the day, Raphael's perspective on policy is a national perspective. So those that are national or international in scope obviously are very helpful to us. But what we found is that that's great, and that is very useful from a policymaking perspective, but we didn't want to ignore the perspectives of medium and smaller businesses, all the different sectors and so on. So the short answer to your question is now we have created a population of businesses that is very broad. And we actually try to make sure that we've got all types of views represented, because what's a situation with a small business or even a sole proprietor would likely be quite different from a very large organization. We think it's important to hear those views as well. So we really feel like everybody is represented in the group. If you have, by the way, either your organization or you work with another organization that you think should be a part of this, you can let either me or Chris know and we can take a look at that. We did look at the list of organizations that are represented today, or that were at least expected to be in here today. And Chris, I think about a fifth of the group that were in here today, we are talking to somebody in your organization. So there's some representation already in the room. Other questions?
I have a two-part question for you. So a few months ago, there was a lot of talk about we're heading towards a recession, all right? Didn't exactly happen. So what would you see would be the contributing factors that would cause us to go into recession? And then on the flip side, what would prevent us from going into recession?
Yeah. So the recession question, and I mean, your observation is very consistent with what we've heard, and that was, we joke about it, we call it the R word, started getting bandied about in the middle of last year, and of course the yield curve inverted, and that created its own kind of set of concerns. As we went into the end of the year, as a matter of fact, what we've reported to Raphael the last couple cycles is that recession fears have really kind of fallen off the table. The specific answer to your question about what could tip us into a recession, first off, I like to emphasize that recessions don't just come around. You hear a lot of people talk about the business cycle, and this has been a very long business cycle. And so I will oftentimes hear that we're due a recession. Well, I don't know that I agree with that, because there's something that happens that drives a recession. We're not hearing anything from our business contacts that will lead us to believe that there's something imminent that's out there. The trade policy tension reduction that perhaps we've experienced over the last few weeks, we think is one of the things that may help to extend the expansion. But this virus is something that, this wasn't on anybody's radar a month ago, and all of a sudden this is becoming a bigger and bigger concern. So I would think that the biggest risk at this point is the kind of the unexpected, just because, like I said, in terms of the things that we traditionally ask about, which would be demand conditions, cost of goods, wages, we're just not seeing a whole lot of movement or unexpected movements that have our business contacts particularly worried. So I remain hopeful that this is an expansion that can continue, but there are always risks that are out there. I mentioned the election earlier. I like to emphasize that the Fed is a nonpartisan. We do not get involved with politics. If you're a Fed follower, I think you know that the chair has gone out of his way to not even respond to questions that have a kind of political angle to them. But we do have an election that's coming up. And so uncertainty related to an election is something that we would be paying attention to, and we are certainly asking our contacts about. And I think as we get further along into the year, that will be something that from an absorbing information perspective will very much be on our radar. But I'm not hearing about, sometimes we press on this, a particular candidate driving a particular behavior. At this point, contacts continue to be moving forward with their plans, and basically what we're hearing is ask me again in 4, 5, 6 months. So perhaps we want to come in that space.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Nan, and again, I want to thank you. Did I mention we'd love for you to be involved in that survey?
Excellent. Chris, thank you so much. I'd like invite up Jonathan Posey. He is a Senior Vice President and Senior Macro Strategy Analyst supporting Bank of America, Private Bank, and Merrill for the Chief Investment Office within Bank of America Corporation. In this role, he is responsible for the analysis of global economic trends, market research, and financial developments in support of economic forecasts, strategic and tactical asset allocation decisions across the wealth management businesses. He's a major contributor to thought leadership on economic market developments and forecasts, and is an active member of the GWIM, which you're going to tell us what that means, Investment Strategy Committee. So welcome, John, to our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, bios are brutal. So thanks, Chris. The format was actually perfect because Wall Street economists are pretty notorious for just shamelessly stealing good academic and Fed research and going out and presenting this around. So it's efficient when Chris goes first, because I can just roll with everything he said. But I'm going to focus on one of the questions from the audience, which when we talk to our business banking clients, our commercial banking clients, the CFOs, CEOs, I think that's the number one question, right? When is the next recession going to be? What's it going to feel like? How are we going to know when it's coming? You know, what's it going to feel like, et cetera. So I'll focus on what I think are some of the recession triggers that go along with Chris's comments. The three big ones for us are monetary policy. Policy's too tight. The Fed's trying to accomplish a goal. Sometimes that can lead to recession. The second one is build up in excesses in the economy. So the financial crisis is a perfect example, right? We're overbuilt in housing. That had to unwind. The deleveraging the housing went to the financial system. That created a pullback in lending, and you ended up in this sort of spiral. That can happen in the business investment sector. That can happen in asset classes. So the tech bubble, right? We're overvalued in certain areas, and when that unwinds, that can cause a recession. And then there's exogenous shocks, right? So coronavirus, what's happening in the rest of the world. Historically, a lot of exogenous shocks played through the oil market. So oil embargoes lead to oil prices spiking, and that leaves less money for consumers in the U.S., which Chris pointed out is a big part of our economy, and that in and of itself can cause a recession. So let me just take those one at a time. I think on the monetary policy side, and probably security will rush me out of here pretty fast as soon as I start talking about monetary policy. Our view is that the bar is just really high for the Fed to raise rates. So as somebody running a business, I would say I think it's very unlikely that the Fed will raise rates this year, and I think probably next year it's probably pretty low probability as well. And we think when the Fed releases their framework review in the middle of the year, it seems like, to Chris's point about symmetry around the 2% inflation target, it seems like the Fed's leaning towards that idea, that if inflation runs persistently below 2% for an extended period of time, that you want to run inflation persistently above 2% for an extended period of time to protect the credibility around your inflation target. And I think credibility is really the key thing that we're focused on right now at the bank in terms of what the Fed's trying to accomplish. So inflation close below 2% is fine, but as you get closer to zero, or if inflation expectations stay persistently below 2%, you're starting to enter that territory of deflation risk, right? And if there's a shock in aggregate demand and prices fall, what do you do as a business owner if prices are falling? You're not going to buy an expensive piece of equipment if prices are falling. You're going to wait. If you're a consumer and you're waiting to buy a car and prices are falling, you're probably going to wait, and that creates a deflationary spiral. So that's why it's important that the Fed maintains kind of credibility around their 2% target. And so we think that sets up the scenario where hikes are probably pretty unlikely. I think we were very pleased to see the Fed shift gears last year in January and then start cutting rates. I think Chris mentioned, what's the neutral rate for the Fed? We probably have it in the lower end of the range. You said 2 to 2.5. I'm probably more in like the Vice Chair Clarida space of 2%. And intuitively, that makes sense that the neutral rate would be 2%. Because if you have 2% inflation and a 2% policy target, that means that's a zero real interest rate at a neutral state, right? So just think about that in your head. when we're trying to just accomplish a neutral goal. That means you get nothing in real terms on interest when you're in a neutral state. So I think monetary policy would probably be accommodative. That's a very good thing for the cycle. We're approaching the 11th year of this expansion. To Chris's point, people just worry generally, how long can this really go? Well, if monetary policy is accommodative, that's one nice tailwind we have. On the earnings front, the profit cycle, from a macro perspective, it reinforces the cycle. Companies make money, they reinvest in the business, people get higher wages, et cetera, it reinforces the cycle, but can also turn the cycle much lower. So there's a few different cross currents happening on the profit cycle. One is slowing naturally, because we're in the second half of the cycle, and what happens is labor costs are going up and pinching margins. So when that happens for companies, they really rely on top line growth, and that's a little bit like walking the tightrope a little bit. As long as top line growth is good, as long as we have decent growth in the economy and we're seeing growth in aggregate demand, companies can keep going. But as margins get tighter and tighter and tighter, the more we can falter on the top line, whatever that's from a shock or another factor, the worse the profit cycle can turn lower. And so while the labor market is great, 50-year low in the unemployment rate, near record job openings, multi-decade low in layoffs in the job market, the stronger the labor market gets, the more months we see where job growth is really strong and wage growth is picking up, the more companies are going to come under pressure on margins. So it's a good thing when the Wall Street Journal reports, oh, job growth was 175,000 again, that's great. But if you're a company, you're thinking, I can't find good workers, and I have to pay them a lot more, and my margins are already tight because at the macro level, margins peaked in 2014 or something like that. Overall profits peaked in 2014. So if I was trying to time this cycle just on profit cycle and the profit margin cycle at the economy-wide level, we should already be in a recession, because that indicator, using flow of funds data from the Fed, after profits peak and margins peak, you usually only have a few years before you're in a recession, because that dynamic plays out, right? Just labor costs get too high and companies are in a pretty tight position. Why hasn't that happened then? Why has the cycle been extended? Well, right around that time, or soon thereafter, we had tax cuts. So after-tax margins got a massive boost and are historically very high. So after-tax margins are keeping the cycle going. And I also think the Fed rate cuts make a big difference. You see it in the aggregate data on profits, in the net interest expenses for companies, that they really did get some relief from the Fed cutting rates and being able to borrow at lower rates. It hit headline interest rates, and then spreads on corporate bonds stayed tight enough where companies can borrow at a pretty decent rate. So that trade-off for companies where they're thinking, what can I borrow at, and what is my sales growth, interest costs versus nominal growth in the economy, that trade-off looks better when you have 50 basis points lower of interest rates. And the same thing goes for consumers in the US. So I think, the profit cycle and the earnings cycle is okay now, right? The earnings that are coming in the public markets are like low single-digit sales growth, low single-digit profits growth. That's fine, it'll keep the cycle going, but you're teetering on the brink of something a little bit dangerous. And when things go bad in the rest of the world and you have multinational companies, that can turn negative pretty quickly. So the rest of the world is certainly something to think about. On that point, trade. Obviously, we had a phase 1 deal on trade. I don't know Lighthizer, I don't know Trump, and I'm extremely hesitant to take anyone's advice on what's going to happen in the trade war, because unless you're one of those two people, you really don't know what you're talking about. So what just assessing the trade 1 deal, sure, we're going to get $200 billion more purchases over the 2017 level, but the big picture is that you're just in a managed trade environment. And is that what businesses want? And I would probably throw that question to you. When we went into this trade war, did businesses want, I just want to be able to compete with the rest of the world and knowing that it's fair and free? Or do I want guaranteed purchases of ag and manufacturing and equipment? That's okay, right? But is that really the solution we're after? So the phase 2 of the trade deal is going to be pretty difficult. And the phase 2 includes things that are closer to national security concerns in terms of intellectual property rights and stealing, theft of the technology, et cetera, and I think that's going to be pretty difficult. I think you also have trade fears now running between the EU and the US. Could that escalate? Maybe. Would that be bad for the global economy? Yes. But the more you're in these trade wars overall, you're just adding uncertainty. And you all know, as business owners, when there's uncertainty, you're less likely to buy that piece of equipment or invest in the new plant, et cetera. And so it makes your decisions much more difficult. So I think phase 2 is probably going to be difficult. The good news is for 2020, we took the escalation risks off the table. There's an enforcement mechanism in the phase 1 of the deal where we can back out at any time. So it's not all clear, but for now, escalation seems to be off the table, and there's a chance that tariffs could move lower if the administration decides to go that route. I'm not sure the election will matter much on the trade war. So 2019 term, the trade war had very bipartisan support, right? Everyone wanted freer and fairer trade, Democrats and Republicans. Democrats are going to criticize the recent actions of the trade war because you're in an election year, right? The game changes when you're in an election year. No one in the Democratic Party is going to say, great job on the trade deal, right? Because you're trying to win an election. And that's a nonpartisan statement, it's just a fact. And the Republicans are going to do the same thing. Great trade deal, vote for us, we'll keep it going. So the fact that this is an election year makes a big difference. And so that, it kind of brings us to the actual election, which I think people want to talk about. And some of the bigger picture things are that most recessions happen in the first year of a presidential cycle, if you look historically. So that would be 2021. And it makes a ton of sense, right? You're trying to win, Trump's trying to win in a re-election now. He wants this economy humming. So he wants the Fed to cut rates. He wants $200 billion of trade purchases and exports because he wants farmers to be selling all their goods and feel good. He's going to want fiscal stimulus this year, infrastructure spending. He's going to want a road bill that spends a ton of money. He wants everyone working. And so it's less likely that you get a recession in a year when you're trying to win re-election because they're going to throw everything they can at this economy to keep it going. And that's like, drinking too much on your 21st birthday and the next day is really no fun. So the first year of a presidential cycle can be pretty bad. The next thing is that you know what you got, right? So it's a good or bad, whether you like the administration or not, you know what you're getting. You know you're getting deregulation, you know you're likely to get tax cuts and not tax hikes, you know you're likely to get a lot of tweets, you know you're likely to get very bizarre policy in terms of national security and trade, and that's what you got. But we don't know who the Democratic primary nominee is going to be, right? I mean, even the Iowa caucus last night seems to be a mess, right? And so that uncertainty changes the game, and then when you enter the first year of the cycle, you don't really know what you're working with. You don't know how the winning presidential candidate is going to shift towards the middle or what they're going to have to do to get their agenda through. So the first year will be totally different, and then that hangover effect. What is the current administration going to do for the economy? You're seeing these like sort of tax reform 2.0. I'm not sure much is going to happen there. I think he can lower tariffs. That can be done with an executive order. So if he wants to stimulate the economy, one way to do it would be to lower tariffs. Would I put it past him? No, because again, he wants to win, and he wants the economy humming. So that's something that could happen. Post-election returns for equity markets, I think it's an interesting thing. I think in the event where you end up with a divided government, it doesn't matter who the president is and who wins the Senate and who wins the Congress. If you have gridlock, the market's like that. Because for investors who are thinking over 1, 3, 5 time frames, all they care about is that, hey, maybe nothing will happen, and then again, I know what I have. So it's not necessarily a terrible scenario if you end up with a progressive candidate, because if you end up with a Republican Senate or Republican Congress, people might think maybe the world's not going to end, or maybe tax hikes are not going to bring us into a recession. So, don't jump to conclusions if progressive nominees start moving ahead. So a recession, just to get back to the point about what causes a recession, I talked about the Fed. I think the Fed's pretty accommodative here for the next few years, I would say. What about the excesses? So macroeconomists like to look at the big sectors of the economy, the investment sectors. That would be housing, consumer spending on autos, commercial real estate, business investment in equipment, because these are big ticket items. Planes are expensive. The piece of equipment are expensive. So when we have excesses in any of those sectors, you could have a recession. At the very macro level, non-financial leverage in the U.S. economy looks more mid-cycle, and that's by a measure from the Chicago Fed that aggregates businesses and consumers. There's a massive difference there. Consumer balance sheets look great. Consumer leverage looks less than early cycle because consumers were terrified coming out of the financial crisis, so they haven't really leveraged up like they have in other cycles. But the business side of leverage in the U.S. economy is extended. The leverage ratios are extremely high. What's the good news there? Interest rates are really low. So if you have a ton of debt and low interest costs, you can survive for longer. When the tide goes out, the game changes. But we're really watching the business side, and I think what you're going to see, one side effect of things like coronavirus, when oil prices fall, is the energy sector suffers. And so they're in the same environment that everyone else is with tight labor market, and when the price of their good falls, you'll start to see a pickup in defaults and pain in those markets. But housing honestly looks like a mid-cycle type housing market. We're just building enough homes really to kind of keep up with demographic demand, which thinking about the millennials really at this point. If you think the average millennial is 31 years old, are they going to move to a single family home? At that point, probably, because they're getting married about 28 and they're having their first kid around 30 and they're having their second kid in their early to mid 30s, and that's when they have to move out. So there's a pretty decent demographic tailwind for housing in an environment where we're certainly not overinvested. The worst thing I can say about the housing market is just that it's overpriced in a lot of areas, including New Jersey where I live. And a lot of that has to do with the tax reform, right? You can't deduct property taxes, but a lot of it just has to do with being in a really long cycle where home prices have been appreciating for a long time. But it's certainly all over the country is different, right? We've seen some very strong housing data. I think actually the Southeast has probably been stronger than some areas, than the Northeast in particular. So I think the domestic side of the U.S. economy, just kind of summarize all those points. The consumer, 70% of our growth, very strong balance sheets, great labor market, decent wage growth, low mortgage rates, plus housing, extremely domestic cycle. I don't care what's happening in the rest of the world when I buy a house. Those decisions happen for other reasons. How many kids am I having? Can I afford to buy that house? That is, we're kind of adding up a domestic part of our cycle that gets to around 85% of our economy. And while a lot of the international stuff makes the headlines, we have some pretty good, strong domestic forces happening. And that kind of begs the question, well, what are we missing on the consumer side? And that's when you enter the coronavirus thing, right? I think in our year ahead outlook, our biggest concern was really, what are we missing on the consumer? Because it's such a big part of our economy and everything looks so good. And Chris also talked about this. And things like coronavirus, what did you see with SARS in 2003? You saw consumer spending in China just collapse. People stopped moving, they stopped getting on the train, they don't go to malls to spend money because they don't want to be in public. They're not in airports to spend money. The dynamics change a little bit, right? So what you're hearing anecdotally is that there are more opportunities just to get goods delivered to you on the consumer side. So that acts as a buffer. There's always offsetting spending when these sorts of crises happen. Some areas do better than others. You might see more travel in Europe than you see in China because people still want to move around. But could it have a massive effect on consumer spending? Sure. Do we have any clue what's going to happen with coronavirus? No, I don't. I have no idea. The last point I want to make is just on sentiment, because I think this cycle looks a lot like the 90s. And I was born in 81, so I was 9 in the early 90s, so I have a lot of academic framework to work on. I think the 90s cycle, right, was previously the longest cycle. It ended with an asset bubble that burst that led to a pullback in business spending. consumer spending didn't contract in that 2000, 2001 tech bubble burst. It slowed significantly, and housing kind of like hiccuped, and then you sowed the seeds for the housing bubble because housing just kind of kept going into the 05, 06 financial crisis. And we're in a scenario where that